The paper hit his desk, and within seconds, the entire room was already moving on, chairs shifting, pages turning, a routine moment that no one thought twice about. But for Marcus, everything slowed down in a way he couldn't explain, because the words in front of him didn't belong to his world. Not yet. Not at 15. Not in a classroom where most students were still trying to keep up with the basics. And yet there it was, staring back at him like a challenge he hadn't asked for, but somehow understood. And in that quiet second where he could have said something, could have raised his hand and fixed the mistake before it became anything more, he didn't. Because deep down he already knew what this paper was. He recognized the structure, the symbols, the level of thinking it demanded, and it wasn't foreign to him. It was familiar in a way that didn't make sense to anyone else in that room. And as the teacher continued handing out the rest of the exams, unaware of what had just landed on Marcus's desk, he made a decision that would quietly shift the direction of everything that followed. Because what he was holding wasn't just the wrong test, it was a door that had opened at the wrong time for the wrong student in the wrong place. And instead of closing it, Marcus picked up his pen and stepped through it without saying a word. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. How did a 15-year-old like Marcus end up with an exam that didn't belong in that room? An exam written for students years ahead of him. Students who had spent far more time preparing for concepts most of his classmates hadn't even heard of yet. And why? In that quiet moment when the mistake could have been corrected without consequence, did he choose to say nothing at all? Why didn't he raise his hand? Why didn't he call the teacher back before she moved on to the next desk? Before the clock started counting down something he wasn't supposed to face? And how did something so small, so easily overlooked, turn into a moment that would echo far beyond that classroom? Into conversations in staff rooms, into discussions among administrators, into a story people would repeat with a mix of disbelief and reflection weeks later. Because this wasn't just about a test being handed out incorrectly. It was about assumptions that had been made long before that paper ever touched his desk. Expectations that had quietly followed Marcus through every class, every assignment, every glance that passed over him without a second thought. And what happened next would force people to confront something they hadn't questioned before, not about the system, not about the school, but about him, about what they thought they understood, and what they had completely missed. Marcus wasn't the kind of student teachers talked about, not the one whose name came up in meetings or casual conversations in the hallway. Not because he lacked ability, but because he had learned, quietly and without complaint, how to exist in the background of a system that rarely paused long enough to notice him. And every morning he walked into the same classroom, sat at the same desk, and opened the same worn textbooks that had been passed down through years of use. Pages marked, corners bent, information outdated but still expected to carry the weight of a proper education. In a school that had been struggling for a long time, where classrooms were filled beyond comfort, where teachers worked hard but were stretched thin, doing what they could with what they had. And for most students that environment became a limit, something that defined how far they could go. But for Marcus it became something else entirely. Because when the final bell rang and the noise of the day faded into the background, he didn't close his books and move on. He carried them with him, back to a small, quiet space where distractions were few but determination was constant, where nights stretched longer than they should have for someone his age, where questions that went unanswered in class became challenges he refused to leave unsolved. And while others rested, Marcus continued, not for recognition, not for praise, but because somewhere along the way he had decided that understanding mattered more than being seen. And discipline became the one thing no one could take from him, even if no one had noticed it yet. Back in the classroom, the clock had already started, and with it came the quiet pressure that filled the air every time an exam began. Pens moving steadily across paper, pages turning in a rhythm that suggested everyone else understood exactly what they were supposed to be doing, while the teacher, already halfway across the room, continued her routine without hesitation, unaware that one desk held something entirely different. And Marcus was still staring at the paper, not in confusion but in recognition, because he knew something was wrong. Not wrong in a way that made him panic, but wrong in a way that made him pause, weighing a decision that would only take a second to make, but would carry far beyond that moment. He could have raised his hand, could have called the teacher back before she moved any farther, could have exchanged the paper and blended back into the same unnoticed rhythm as everyone else. But he didn't. And instead of correcting the mistake, he accepted it, not out of defiance, but out of something quieter, something rooted in the countless hours he had spent preparing for moments no one else knew he was preparing for. And slowly, without drawing attention, Marcus picked up his pen and began, not guessing, not testing his luck, but solving, moving through each question with a level of focus that separated him from the noise around him. Each line he wrote building on something he had already worked through before, somewhere else, at another time, and as minutes passed, something began to shift, not loudly, not in a way that stopped the room, but in a way that was just enough to be noticed if someone had been paying close attention. Because while others were still trying to understand the questions in front of them, Marcus was already moving ahead, and within minutes, something didn't make sense. At first, no one noticed, because classrooms like this were used to quiet effort, to students keeping their heads down and working through whatever was placed in front of them. And Marcus looked no different from a distance, just another student focused on his paper, another pen moving across the page. But then something shifted, something small enough to miss if you weren't paying attention, and yet clear enough to stop someone who was. Because the teacher, midway through scanning the room, slowed her steps, her attention drawn back to a single desk that didn't match the rhythm of everything else, and she turned, not abruptly but with growing curiosity, and began walking back toward Marcus, each step closing the distance between assumption and realization. Because something about the way he was working didn't fit. It wasn't hesitation, it wasn't the kind of pause that comes from uncertainty. There was no second-guessing, no erasing, no searching for direction. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't struggle. This was certainty, the kind that comes from understanding something deeply, not just remembering it. And as she reached his desk and looked down at the paper in front of him, the moment settled in with a weight she hadn't expected, because what she saw wasn't a student trying to make sense of something beyond his level. It was a student moving through it with precision, line by line, step by step. And that's when everything changed, because Marcus wasn't just attempting the exam he had been given by mistake. He was solving it, and he was solving it correctly. The room didn't stop. Pens kept moving, chairs creaked, pages turned as if nothing had shifted, but the teacher did, standing still beside Marcus's desk, caught between what she expected to see and what was actually in front of her, because the test on that desk was never meant to be in that room. It wasn't part of the standard stack she had handed out. It was an advanced mathematics paper, the kind reserved for students who had spent years building toward it, students placed on a path that assumed readiness, guidance, and attention. And yet here it was, completed line by someone no one had placed on that path. And somehow Marcus was moving through it with a level of control that didn't come from luck or chance. It came from familiarity, from repetition, from time invested where no one had thought to look. And the realization settled in slowly but firmly, because he hadn't seen this exact paper before. He hadn't been given special access or extra instruction inside that classroom. He had simply prepared in a way that no one had noticed, in a way that existed outside the boundaries people had quietly drawn around him. And in that moment, the mistake on his desk stopped being just an error and became something else entirely, a reflection of how easily someone could be overlooked when expectations were set too early and never questioned again. What happened that day didn't just change how one teacher saw Marcus. It lingered long after the bell rang and the papers were collected, long after the classroom emptied and the routine of the day tried to move on as if nothing unusual had taken place. Because moments like that have a way of staying with people, of resurfacing in quiet conversations and reflective pauses, and it forced more than just a single realization. It pushed an entire school to confront a question that had been sitting unnoticed for far too long. How many students like Marcus had passed through those same halls, sat in those same desks, and left without anyone ever recognizing what they were capable of? How many had been measured by expectations that were never challenged, placed into categories that were never revisited, and quietly overlooked not because they lacked ability, but because no one had taken the time to truly see them? And as that question settled in, it became harder to ignore, because sometimes the moments that seem like simple mistakes are the ones that reveal something much deeper, something that had been there all along, waiting to be acknowledged. And in Marcus's case, It wasn't just about solving an exam he was never meant to take. It was about exposing a truth that had been right in front of everyone, unnoticed, until it couldn't be anymore. What would you have done if you were sitting in Marcus's place that day, holding a paper you knew wasn't meant for you, knowing you had a choice in that moment to speak up and correct it or stay quiet and face something no one expected you to handle? Would you have trusted yourself enough to take that risk, or would you have played it safe and let the opportunity pass without ever knowing what you might have been capable of? Because moments like that don't come with instructions. They don't come with guarantees. They come quietly and disappear just as quickly, and the decision you make in that space can say more about you than anything that comes after. So would you have raised your hand, or would you have done exactly what Marcus did and let your actions speak instead? Let me know in the comments. And if this story made you stop and think about how often people are judged before they're understood, make sure you subscribe, because the next story might challenge what you think you already know even more.